Well, I suppose we are on. Well, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the ECOM European Conference on Mobility Management 2020. This is the sixth webinar that the conference is having this strange month of June of 2020 that we'll never forget in our lives, for sure. The sixth webinar is dedicated to the theme of social inclusion and inequalities, and that connection with the mobility patterns and the mobility management. My name is João Seixas. I am professor of urban planning and strategic planning at the Nova University of Lisbon, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. The session will last 90 minutes, 1.5 hours, and will include a first opening introduction by Isabel Botelho, which is the Director of the Studies, Evaluation and Prospective Services at IMT, the Institute for Mobility and Transports in the administration of the National State of Portugal. I will pass you the word right away, but before I would like to tell you all the scheme that we have for this afternoon. And afterwards, we will have three speakers, one from Portugal, one from Holland, and another one from Germany. Anabela Ribeiro, Nick van Appelhausen, and Rebecca Carbauer. Then I am sure we'll have a very good time for debates and for reflections, both from you, the public, which I would ask already not to wait for the debate time to make your questions and reflections. You can make it directly via the chat to the secretary that we have in our support, and also some reflections from myself as a moderator. I will take this opportunity in the first place to thanks to some acknowledges to the Câmara Municipal de Cascais, the municipality of Cascais, which is the coordinator of all this European conference of this year, and particularly to Paulo Marques, Beatriz Gonçalves, and Robert Stussy. Thank you to you all. I would like only to say two more things, which is about the thematic that we are dealing here today, about social inclusion. The two things are about what is social inclusion in terms of our cities and metropolitan areas, and the other thing is the connection between social inclusion, social justice, and the mobility management. Of course, that we are seeing now with the pandemic circumstances that we are living today, these months, that the inequalities are both consequence and cause of the crisis, of the different types of crises that we have. One of the main issues for a good mobility and urban planning, as well as good and sound urban and regional and territorial politics, will be for the reduction of the social and economic inequalities, but not only social and economic, also spatial inequalities. The right to the city is quite crucial in these days and for the future. So, as you professionals of mobility and transportations quite well know, it's fundamental for all of us to work in more just cities, and if we do that, I am sure, we are all sure that we will make a new kind of progress, even in terms of economic development. So I will leave other reflections after hearing our speakers today. Now I will pass the word to Isabel Botelho. Isabel?
Hello, good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to the ECOM Online. As you know, the physical meeting of ECOM 2020 in Cascais was postponed to next year, and EPOM and the municipality of Cascais decided to organize this unique event that gathers authors of the submitted papers on a series of online debates. I want to thank all the authors that accepted this challenge of participating on these online debates. It is a different format than the one that we are used to. Surely we miss the networking opportunities provided by the ECOM physical meetings and the friendly dinners, of course, but these online sessions are providing us with a new way to share our ideas. These sessions will not only reflect on the most important themes regarding mobility, but will also provide food for thought on the issue of mobility after the COVID-19 pandemic. Until the moment, we had some very interesting and participated sessions where the
Isabel,
focus of...
I'm sorry to
Yes?
interrupt. We are not seeing your image.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, why is that so?
Yes, you're on.
Okay.
Now we have
Okay,
the
good. Good. Well, I'm going a little backward. I was saying that last sessions were very participated and focused on mass, circular and shared economy, disruptive technologies, new mobility, and how to nudge people into new mobility. Today, we will hold the sixth debate dedicated to the theme of inequalities, mobility management as a tool for social inclusion. As a matter of fact, transport inequalities are a complex subject that can be looked at from different angles at a global level. You can look at the geographical dimension of transport inequality and identify all territories where the populations are excluded from adequate transport services. For instance, you can focus on accessibility on rural areas where you might be confronted with the lack of an adequate infrastructure, which can provide safe and timely access to rural populations, or maybe a rural area with proper transport infrastructure, but where public transport services or other sustainable mobility solutions are not available, nudging the populations into using private cars. Or even rural areas that are properly served by public transport, but only during work days or during the school months, leaving gaps, time gaps where entire rural populations are not provided with a minimum level of accessibility. On the other hand, if you rather set your focus on transport inequalities at urban areas, you will find a whole new set of different transport inequality issues. For a start, you can look at the increasing house costs on urban centers, which frequently push the populations with less economic resources to greater distances, while the prices for long distance public transport on the metropolitan areas remain high and become a strong deterrent for mobility. If urban population is not able to access the basic services like health, for instance, its quality of life will get worse and its accessibility levels will become even more reduced, leading to a vicious circle. We can also choose to focus on the social dimension of inequality and find that territories with good levels of transport services often contain populations that are excluded from those transport services for economic or other reasons. In fact, transport services are often built to serve the needs of the active population, and the elder and youth can easily be excluded. So we can ask ourselves, are we providing adequate proximity transport services to serve the needs of those who use neighborhood services like schools, daycare centers, pharmacies, local markets? Are the vehicles properly designed to be used by them? And are the transport prices affordable? On the other hand, a new set of mobility services is quickly becoming available, but on many cases, the access to those services, or to access those services, you need to know how to use a smartphone. Are we rolling out a set of services that cannot be used by other populations? Well, finally, a very important challenge for today's debate will also be to consider the impacts of the current pandemic on transport inequalities. Elder and more vulnerable populations must be provided with special safety measures that will ensure that the current pandemic will not deter their accessibility to their destinations. How will we be able to achieve that? Are there any solutions already being provided to those populations, for instance, reserved areas on public transport? In the end, I would like to stress that today's debate is done with zero transport emissions. How will we be able to start using transport again within a path that will lead us to carbon neutrality by 2050 is an issue that needs to be considered in order to achieve that target. And now, I think that it's time to give the floor to the moderator, João Seixas, and to the speakers, which will today reflect on all these issues. So I wish you a lively debate and hope to meet you all in person next year in Cascais. Bye-bye.
Okay, fine. You have made several main questions concerning urban and regional mobility. We will thank you for that. That's good. And also the connection with the most vulnerable groups that we have in our societies. We have many questions and some possible and necessary answers for the future, for the next future. We cannot wait too much for answering some of those needs in terms of social patterns and urban mobility, urban and regional mobility, and also due to the coronavirus impacts and the pandemic impacts. We have to take care about how the mobility patterns and mobility accessibility is going to be made in our cities and metropolises for the future. Well, I will leave for the reflections that I've told previously for the end. For the second part, I would like to present the speakers. And the first speaker is Professora Anabela Ribeiro. She's professor at the University of Coimbra in the areas of mobility and transportation. And I will give you right away the words. Anabela, please.
Okay, so good afternoon, greetings to all, and thank you for this opportunity to talk a little bit about the subject that has always been and that has now become of utmost importance, which is our mobility and the possibility of accessing our needs and the difficulties faced by the most fragile. So we have now an added responsibility to think more within the social sphere, which has become a word now full of sides, and at the same time outside the box, about the future in which happiness is possible despite these new difficulties. So the word happiness is something I would like to start with because it brings countless correspondence within our daily life, starting with the mental and physical health, and so if we can move easily and safety. So these are the words for the future, in my opinion, in what concerns mobility management. So which are happiness, health, safety, both at the individual and at the collective level. So the term efficiency, I think we don't need to worry with it because it is implicit in these other words. So focus on social besides the usual environmental, economic, and institutional sustainability. So this means thinking about everyone and start thinking with the most forgotten: children, older adults, people with disabilities, and other type of difficulties in accessing the activities, like being poor, for example. So rethinking cities for them, for these groups, is rethinking cities for all. This has been central in my research work in last years. The MobiH project, I will just share the screen just to show you the website of this project I'm working with, which main aim is to promote active and sustainable mobility in the city of the future, focusing on the elderly people, so on the older adults group. You can check the website, it's available, it's also in English. And as I was saying, MobiAge is focusing in the group of the older adults, thinking about their special needs and mainly overcoming some preconceptions and the idea that they do not move anymore. Because life hope increased, as we know. Older adults are much more active than we might think. So to move between home and city center and for small shopping, this increased their health capacity globally, both at the level of psychological well-being and at the level of physical defenses also. Their number in society is no longer small. So, for example, in many cities in Portugal, the number of older adults is now being more than double the population that is under 15. So cities face this population increase, and associated we have also some main phenomena concerning, for example, city centers. The older residents are put away from their homes and environments because of this phenomenon like Airbnb. And they are put away from their familiar places where they usually can walk. So by this means, their isolation increase as transportation becomes an even bigger problem under this pandemic situation. The older tourists is also a growing group, although the number of foreigner tourists is now frozen. So therefore, and besides the factors that literature review teaches, like slope, pavement, control for car circulation and parking, talking with these older persons is fundamental to understand what is away from common sense. This was an important achievement of this project. So public participation, not expecting people to participate, but effectively organizing participation schemes, really talking with people. This always was, is, and will be a fundamental part of mobility management in the future, like to know local realities in order to adapt mobility conditions for each population segment. This project focused in two main issues, like walking in public transportation. In terms of walking, all Portuguese city centers and many other urban zones are more tailored to the car, in spite of some improvements that happened in recent years with programs that support urban renewal. But under a pandemic situation, creating conditions means increasing the public space dedicated to walking and increasing the sense of safety. For example, I can give a simple example with special availability of places where these older persons can rest, and of course the others also. More seats without the need to be near other persons when they need to rest. Conditions like this one must be rethinking along with the usual factors. On the side of public transportation conditions, public transport systems face several difficulties. Although some improvements occur in the last years, I give the example of small buses that cross city centers and that are useful both for older residents and for older tourists. One important aspect on this is that older adults usually do not work anymore, and so they have more ability to move out of rush traffic hours. So this means that transport system must adapt to this new need and to this growing group in order to allow older people, which are more vulnerable, to move across the city, minimizing social interaction, but at the same time keeping activity and their social contexts. So this is very important. And both in the case of urban transport and of the transport by request in rural areas, the issue of social distance inside the vehicle will change our optimization models, objectives, conditions, and factors for sure. So these paradigms in mobility management, which are not new, but are now reinforced, are, first of all, to promote global goals, to decrease pollution, increase sustainable mobility, improve equity in the access to spaces and public transport systems, improving health, guarantee safety, promote happiness for all ages and needs. And also to promote mobility management, we have this attachment with new information technologies, which are becoming even more important in pandemic times like this. But at the same time, technologies must adapt to all limitations and needs. And this is a huge challenge for the future with the arriving of shared, automated and electric mobility also. So another important issue is to minimize the going to some shopping, the delivering of small goods will increase. So for example, just to give a small example, cargo bikes are there to help, and globally bicycles are a fantastic and resilient transport mode, even for older adults. So above all, we also need to control for the increase of trips by car that we can expect from this situation, because among other consequences, they take out city space that should be available for walking. However, for the elderly that still drive, and for the elderly that will be able to use automated shared vehicles in the future, we can expect that. The priority to park near shops, for example, must be established. Multimodality might be especially important in terms of most of the trips done by this group, combining walking and public transport. So above all, what city do we want in the future? We must start to visualize the future city and its new mobility trends. So think outside the box, think ahead all the time. Mobility conditions and accessibility possibilities are the main trend in future cities, relating, conditioning, and promoting many other aspects of our lives. But the future tends to be more unpredictable, so models need to change. And the relation between urban development and mobility is even more tight now. The rescheduling of working and leisure times can help to minimize the impacts of our access to activities in terms of safety and health. So what policies, plans, projects for infrastructure changes will we need to achieve in what concerns active modes and public transports? As I was saying, these paradigms were always present in the most recent research, for example, but are now reinforced and given priority. Just to end this small speak, I would like to give you two questions we must make, everyone must make, and people working in the field must make also, to help us in this rethinking. The first question is, what do I want for the future of cities? What do I want to move? What kind of conditions I want to move for my personal mobility? What makes me healthier? What will make me happy? And to my children. So this is the first, not a question, more like a group of questions. The second group of questions is, how can we act as collective in order to have the best possible conditions for all the groups, to include everyone? What are the givebacks and the trade-offs each individual and each group needs to make? So what can make my neighbor children and grandpas happier? So I think we should make these questions all the time while doing our researches and while contributing to a better society in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Annabella. Please stay with us. Your contribution is being quite remarkable. Main questions that you ask. I ask for Beatriz to put me again. Am I on? Yes, because I'm not sure about it. Is it?
It is.
I suppose, yes. Okay, I suppose so. Nick, I will pass you the word right away, but before that, just a small resume of what I understood from the important issues that Annabella has raised. In my view, in terms of three fundamental dimensions. The first of all about political philosophy itself and what are the main values that should drive us in the management and in the strategic planning of our cities and our territories. She has spoken about not about spatial distance, but about social distance, which is quite fundamental for us to understand, and about a concept as vast and transversal as happiness. Of course, some of our main economists are being discussing for more than 2 decades ago, including the Nobel Prize Joseph Stiglitz, for instance, about the importance not to measure the progress not only in terms of GDP, but also in other indicators, namely the happiness indexes. That's not easy to put in the main political agendas, but in the cities and the territories, maybe we can have some very good grounds to do that. So it's a question in terms of political and economic value. The second question, when Annabella told about, she is researching on the elder people, and we in Europe know very well that our continent is becoming quite old in terms of demographic situations, and the importance to talk with them directly and understand their possibilities of mobility in the territories. That's fundamental too. So it's a kind of second part, a processual part in terms of co-production of politics in our different scales of the cities. And finally, knowledge that we have. We have already some very good knowledge and technological capabilities to make that changes in terms of urban planning, in terms of multimodality, management and understanding, in terms of shared mobility, as I'm sure one of the speakers, I suppose it's Rebecca, is going to speak about that. So main issues that have to be discussed. And now I will give the words to Nick. I will try to say it. Dutch is a very difficult language to speak, including the names, as you know. Nick van Happeldoer, I hope it is all right, who comes from, who works for something called metamorphosis, which is a concept I like very much in terms of urban management and understanding at Breda University. And I suppose he's going to speak about child-friendly neighborhoods. Nick.
Hi, yes, that's the plan.
Okay.
Thank you, Isabella, for your talk. It's really interesting to see that even though your research focused more on the elderly, my research is more focused on the younger generations, and that there are a lot of connections between them. So thank you for this opportunity. And since it is a debate, I also organized my part in the debate structure. So I will sort of begin with painting the context that COVID-19 is affecting our society and mobility management right now. Then I'll post my statements in relation to this topic, and then I give several arguments that underline the importance of that statement. And to close up, I will give some practical examples from the project Metamorphosis, and also a bit of a sneak peek for the projects called Dignity, which really focus on the barriers for digitalization for elderly and mobility poverty. So the first step. So currently the world is quite on hold during this coronavirus, and this will probably continue to do so for quite some time. Like we can hope that we have a vaccine within a year, but that is quite ambitious. If you look at what we did for the AIDS virus, for example, it took us 40 years and we still don't have a vaccine, and we spent so much money on it to get it. So to think that it will be here for quite some time is quite a good chance. So and even if we manage to get it soon and are able to produce on a large scale, if we don't have to cool it, the vaccine, so we can easily distribute it and make it affordable, we still have one problem left. There are 6 known coronaviruses to affect the human population. With 3 of them, we know that if you get a severe case, you will be immune for 1 to 2 years, not longer than that. So the simple idea of herd immunity for this coronavirus. It's just hoping that you will be immune for a longer period. But also, if you have a vaccine, then the chances are really good that it only gives you immunity for 1 to 2 years. And then if there's mutation, it will be a hit or miss. So this will really impact on how we see our cities, how we live our cities, and how we move in those cities. Because how does it impact mobility? As we know, people travel less. We are here now digital instead of all in Portugal. But also on a daily basis. Like in the Netherlands, for example, public transportation is less than 30% of what it used to be, even though we have a public transportation COVID capacity of 40%. So there's an overcapacity in public transportation, and that is something we haven't had in years. Like trains are always overcrowded, and now there's an overcapacity. At the same time this month, the amount of car usage was at the same levels as pre-corona times. So this is really a big challenge that we see people still very conscious about the coronavirus, travel less, but if they travel, they often choose for their car. And there's also a light bulb. A lot of more people use active mobility measures, even in the Netherlands, like the sale of bikes has never been better in a long time. And this is not something we only see over here, but we also see it in other countries. People are really going to explore like what active mobility can do for them. So this is the context of where the world will be going now. Like we will have COVID here around for quite some time. Public transportation is going to be less popular for quite some time. Shared mobility is possibly also going to be less popular because you don't know how clean it was. And if the person who used it before you might have COVID. And if we think then, and people want to cycle more. So if we talk about inequalities in mobility management as a tool for inclusion, the first thing that triggered me was inequalities. Are we going to talk about equalities or equity? And I would like to share like a picture with this, which really was insightful for me. Equality is giving everybody a bike. Equity is really tailored to the needs of a person that they can actually use it. And I think that the roads are a perfect example of an equal approach. Like the road is there, everybody can use it, but then there's the if you have a driver's license and if you have a car. And this is something that is going to change. Like if we want to think really about inclusive mobility management, we also have to talk about the equity of the measures that we include. So the equality is the state of being equal, especially status, rights, and opportunities. Everybody, and equity is much more about granting equal opportunities for people to use it and to really tailor to the different needs so people have the freedom to do so. Like in the example I showed you, you can give an elderly woman a bike and then hope she will use it. But if she's in a wheelchair, chances are not very big that she will do it. So this is really about thinking, what do different groups of people need? And that is also what Isabella did with her research. Really talk to the elderly and ask them, what do you need in order to move around, to be happy and have a sense of social inclusion, social equity, and spatial equity. And that is also something I focused on. Because this is now more urgent than it was 5 years ago. Like social equity in transportation is generally analyzed along social demographic lines, such as income, race, gender, and age. And to what extent do they all have access to transportation? What COVID is showing, like it will probably be the biggest recession that we had in the last maybe 100 years. And a lot of people will probably be less rich than they are now and maybe have to sell their car. And then you really come into a situation that you have an environment, especially if you have health risks, that is more dangerous for you to travel in. And also you're less capable of doing so because money becomes an issue. And this gives you a limitation in the amount of people that you meet. Are you able to meet your grandchildren? Are your grandchildren able to meet you? Can you go to that job that is 3 hours away? If you could go by car in an hour, but you can't if you don't have a car anymore. So we really have to think about also diversificating those cities by giving people the opportunity to travel with a more accessible means. And also something that Isabella mentioned, bikes are a great example of that because the investment is relatively low but then you also have to check out like what do those people need to actually use it. And the other side is the spatial equity part of it. So spatial equity, at the moment you see great examples, for example, in Paris, in which it's transforming its city center to be more bike positive, to give space for people to cycle around. But those are often also the locations that not necessarily need the biggest investment. Like if you look at the outskirts of a city, there is less opportunity for public transport, and more people have to use their car, and cycle lanes are often not invested in. And that is really something that we should think about. Like if we want to think about inclusive and equity mobility management, it's also about diversification, not only in the city center, but in all neighborhoods, and make it and give everybody like the opportunities that they need. So my thesis is that if we want to keep cities livable and inclusive with a high level of equity, we need to make massive investments in active mobility to mitigate also the drop in popularity for public transport, because we simply don't have the road capacity if all public transport users switch to their cars because of COVID. And if we focus on cars instead of active mobility, cities will be less inclusive because not everybody has a car or the possibility to drive a car. And that will result in a drop in spatial equity and social equity. And I truly believe that this is a moment that we will see changes in cities. Like some cities will really make that step towards active mobility, and other cities will have more of a business as usual approach and let the car flourish again, which is not an impactful, not a positive thing for our cities. And this is something, if you want to have a city that functions for your children, that you feel happy in, that you have a clean environment, a healthy environment, more cars is not the way we should go to. So the big question is like, we can promote active mobility, but do people also want to use it? And that is something my research focused on. Like if you look at Metamorphosis, it's a project that is for 3 million. It's in 3 years, and we invested in 7 countries, all sort of behavioral change measures with children, and see like, do they work? Like what works in that city? Why does it work in Tilburg, but not in Alba Iulia in Romania, for example? What are the cultural differences also between Southampton and how we in the Netherlands perceive bike usage? And one of the parts that we did in that research is that we asked for 10 primary schools in Tilburg, all the children, how they currently going to school and how do they want to go to school. And that was something that surprised me quite a bit, because the car usage didn't change. Like children that at the moment are currently going by car to school probably have almost the same percentage of how they want to go to school. So if you are not affected by active mobility or don't try it out or don't experience on a daily basis, you're also not that inclined to start doing it. The massive change within active mobility was between walking and cycling. Because on average in the Netherlands, which is really a cycle-friendly country, 28% of the kids came that day to school by bike. But 84% of those kids wanted to go by bike. That is a big change. That's almost 20% more kids that are currently walking to school that want to cycle to school. And then we ask the question like, why do they at the moment mostly walk to their school? And it has to do also with school policies, but also mobility poverty could be a great way to investigate more. And that's quite new on our radars. And currently we're investigating like what could be the explanations for the differences between schools. And really look, okay, could poverty could be an issue? Could ethnic background be an issue? Could like the policy from school be an issue, to really pinpoint that out? If you know more about that, we'll probably talk about it on the next Ecom conference. But it shows that kids want to cycle to school, and even in schools where there was already a very high percentage of kids that were already cycling, more kids want to bike to school. And that is also something I experienced in Canada. I worked on a project in Calgary. It's a very car-dependent city. It's looks like an American city. And people really take their car to go to the other side of the street to buy a bag of biscuits. And there they created a separate cycle lane because it's so important that you also create the sense of safety. And in the beginning, it were only like the fit, healthy men in their with their helmets and their shiny clothes going on their bikes because they had the courage to do it over there. But when they implemented the several cycle lanes, the amount of people who use it doubled every year. And I think that's also a challenge to see like how can we design it in a way that a kid who's 8 years old is able to cycle there safely, and also elderly woman for the age of 80. How can she move around safe in that area? Because if you design for both target groups, it will work for everybody. And that is really a big step that we have to make in cities. When I was last year in Zurich, that was the first time I fell off my bike in years. And that was because I had a big Jeep driving in front of me and a big Jeep behind me. I had to cycle on the road because there was no separate cycle lane and the big Jeep put on his brakes. Nowhere I could go, so I fell. And that is for someone who was a Dutch guy, practically born on a bike. And it was for me really insightful. I think that is one of the first steps we should make if you want to think about inclusive city designs. Think about the needs of the different groups and how we can cater for them. And this is also something we are going to investigate more in the other projects, what's called Dignity. Dignity really focuses on mobility poverty and the digital gap between elderly population and mobility. Because it's great if we have all those new technologies in mobility, but if they don't know how to use it, it's not inclusive, and it will also not create an equity approach to making cities more friendly for all, to have a more happy environment for your children as well. This is a project that's now in its beginning stages, and we do it in 4 cities, in Ancona, in Tilburg, the region of Vlaams Gewest, and in Barcelona, and we're really figuring out on how that works. And it's really about changing the mindset also of the people who live in there, because if you show that people actually want to travel actively, how do you get also the political pressure to change the city? And that is something which was for me very powerful in Metamorphosis. What we did, we in Tilburg organized 6 school scans. So what you do, you walk with a group of kids through a city and ask them, what did you like and what do you don't like? What should be improved? And then you ask them to come up for solutions. After that session, you let them present it to city officials. And just after doing 6 school scans, Tilburg is now rethinking all its school zones with the input of children. And it's really about the coalition of children, their teachers, and their parents. If you have those 3 in one room and they agree on something, there's a good chance that we have sufficient political power to actually change something in a city. Because I'm also not a spin doctor, but for a politician, it is quite hard to be against the wishes of children. It's not very likable. So if you have them on your side and also the elderly population and really have that active participation process, there are great things you can do in a city to make them more inclusive. So as a closing statement, to sum it up, I really think that COVID will change our mobility also for the upcoming years. It's not something that will be fixed next year. We can just favor car mobility to mitigate the drop in popularity of public transport. We just don't have the road capacity for it. And not all groups are hurt equally from this pandemic. And that is something we should really think about, also from an equality perspective. Equal is to restrict all the people to travel outside and have a full-on lockdown. Even though the equity approach is more focusing on who has the biggest risks to do it. That's the fairness in it. And that is a very difficult debate to think about. And I find it hard to have a position in that, but I think that is something we also should discuss today, like what is the equal approach and what is the equity approach? Active mobility measures are, from my point of view, the only reasonable approach to keep cities livable now and in the future. We can all use our cars to go everywhere. We just don't have the space for it, especially if we have a growing urbanization. What the EU project Metamorphosis showed us is the potential of an equity approach in mobility management and that people actually want to cycle. And if you build a coalition around those people, you can have some sufficient impact. And I hope that the project that's called Dignity will learn us more about how this big gap, how big this gap actually is, and what we will need to bridge this for truly inclusive cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. You have passed a little bit the 15 minutes. It was 16 minutes, but that's fine. That's fine. Thank you very much. You have also spoken in a very important way. The equity issues, equity as a main strategic concept, which I fully agree. Different solutions for different needs and different groups, both in terms of mobility options, but also in terms of public spaces options.
Yes.
As mobility experts, you know better than me. I'm not a mobility expert, it's more strategic planning, but I fully agree it's a complexion of the multimodality, shared mobility, urban planning, and all those things connected. The focus that you put on children, and much more than on children, on schooler communities, if I might say, I don't know if these are the right words in English, schooler communities, in terms of children, teachers, and families, it's relevant. It's fundamental. I would ask not for your answer now, but also for Annabella, because we are having already some questions, and I will remember for the audience that you can make the questions via the chat that we have, and I will receive the questions. I will put to our speakers about three main gaps in terms of previous equity circumstances that we have. Okay, we are talking about most vulnerable groups, and we have heard some reflections about the elder people and also the children. There are other vulnerable groups, of course. For instance, here in my country, and due to the coronavirus pandemic impacts, about 3/4 of the new unemployment is from women who have to be at home, which have more precarious jobs. And so the impact is quite strong in terms of the female employment and female opportunities in our cities. So we have, as far as I could see for the moment in our debate, three main gaps in terms of equity, precisely. The economic gaps, but also, as you spoke, in the spatial gaps. For instance, one of the questions to Annabella, but also for you, and I'm sure also for Rebecca, is going to be, okay, we can implement those fantastic and quite innovative ideas in our city centers, in a more dense territories, but how can we work with more isolated metro areas and metro neighborhoods, away from the main concentrations and the main centers? How can we work with the isolated countryside small cities, which are completely dependent on automobile vehicles for their quotidianity things? And another gap, considering the shared and the technological issues that we have today and for the future, is the digital gap for the children and for the elder, precisely, for instance. Just reflections for you to consider for the second part of the debate, and I will give the word to Rebecca. Rebecca Krachbaumer comes from Bremen, as I can spell it correctly, and she's going to speak with us to us about care sharing action plan and the shared mobilities that she's working on. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Joao, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the audience, wherever you're joining us from in this global situation. So I, as Joao said, I work for the city of Bremen in northern Germany as a sustainable mobility project coordinator and on shared mobility issues. I also coordinate a European project called Share North, funded by the Interreg North Sea Region program. And it's a project in which we deal with all sorts of aspects of shared mobility, including social inclusion. We have a number of activities in the project, such as bicycle libraries that allow families to borrow bicycles for their fast-growing children and give them accessibility to this sustainable transport mode. We have volunteer ride-sharing schemes for the elderly and people with physical impairments and in wheelchairs, for instance. So we cover a lot, and we also discuss, the controversies about shared mobility, still as part of a niche, project, making up a still relatively small share of the mobility market, and issues of accessibility of technology, requirements of bank accounts, and so on and so forth. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is about spatial inclusion and about designing the urban realm with shared mobility in mind and with mobility hubs in mind to be more socially inclusive. And I brought a number of photos that I want to share with you. There we go. So this is a street in the city of Bremen around the 1890s. And as you can see, it's a very socially inclusive space. There's space for children, for deliveries, for adults, people of all ages. And roads have one purpose. It's access to these towns. And you can imagine what it looks like now. This is a case that's not unique to Bremen, but very common in many cities across the globe. It looks like this today. This is not an inclusive space. This is a space for the storage of vehicles. And as you can see, there are no children on the street playing, which would be nice to see. So those number of vehicles cause quite a lot of problems as far as accessibility is concerned, in blocking pedestrian crossways, something like this, for example, which is supposed to be a safe and accessible crossing for pedestrians, for the elderly, for children, for anybody, basically. And this is now a challenge to get across. Here's another example, either out of sheer ignorance or disregard. This is a pedestrian space with tactile elements for the visually impaired. But these automobile owners seem to think that it's a parking space exclusively for them. There you go. And here, another example of new forms of shared mobility. We call them disruptive forms of shared mobility that also pose a new challenge for cities and the social inclusiveness and safety of that public space. So while for some members of the public, it's a sheer nuisance, like this trash truck driver who can't do his job because he can't get through, because of the number of people, or the woman here on the left on the sidewalk who is just unable to get past with her bicycle and not walk by due to cars parked in the pavement. For them, it's a matter of inconvenience. For other members of the public, however, it's a matter of freedom, that freedom to move around the city in a safe way, and even just to get out of their front doors. This is a newspaper article from a few years ago where an elderly gentleman got stuck between a trash can and a car. And this is a situation that's unacceptable, but quite common in many cities, I would say. And it's also a matter of safety. When our friends in the big red trucks can't get through the streets because of the number of privately owned vehicles, this poses a safety threat to everyone. What do we do in the Shared Project? And it's something that many cities around Europe, at least, are starting to implement, are mobility hubs. Hubs for shared mobility in an easily accessible, highly visible place in the public realm that connect several modes of transport and sustainable transport. In the Shared Project, a mobility hub for us always includes shared cars and sometimes public transport, cycling, and pedestrian infrastructure. And in Germany, they're called Mobilpunkte. In Belgium, there are Mobi hubs. In the Netherlands, there are Mobipunkten, mobility hubs. The concept is basically to provide in a decentralized format in places where journeys start, to provide alternatives to individual car ownership and modes of transport that make it easy and flexible. And those can be either the large hubs like we have in Bremen, the Mobilpunkte, or smaller, really small scale neighborhood size hubs called Mobilpunktchen, as we call them here in Bremen, with just a few vehicles and aspects. But when I talk about the issue of social inclusion, it means that mobility hubs, Mobilpunkte, can be so much more than just making different modes of transport available to the public. they can go above and beyond, especially when planners think outside the box. What else can one do for the community? And for us, that means improving spatial equity simply through how we design these mobility hubs and services, like accessibility for trash collection, fire trucks, large vehicles, public transport in very narrow neighborhood streets, or improving simply pedestrian crossings through changing intersections to be more barrier-free with tactile elements for people with visual impairments, lowered curbstones for people in wheelchairs, walkers, and so on. So, it goes much more beyond providing mobility services. We always do something a bit extra. Here's another example from one neighborhood where it's a school crossing near a school, where you can see the before and after images above. How implementing a mobility hub there gave us the opportunity simply to improve the design and make it more inclusive and also safer for especially vulnerable groups by reducing the size of the intersection. And we've had this experience that with planning mobility hubs, even if we don't provide specific space for micromobility forms, it still has a ordering effect, an effect that the public realm is ordered and creates sort of natural order to reduce some of these barriers that we see arising through these new micromobility forms like the shared e-scooters. Another positive effect of the mobility hubs that we saw is that it contributes to the gender mainstreaming of our public realm. When we planned mobility hubs in Bremen, for instance, we asked users of the car sharing services about what is important to them, and saw a distinct difference between the responses of male and female users. And among the female users, we saw that the short distance between stations is very important, as well as the visibility of the stations in the public realm, which convey a greater sense of safety rather than mobility hubs or mobility services in general being in back lots or parking garages and so on. So mobility hubs can contribute to this social equity among the genders as well, depending on how they're designed and where they're placed. And then finally, I wanted to bring in one example from our Norwegian project partner, the city of Bergen in Norway, who's also planning mobility hubs as inspired by the city of Bremen. And this is an example from the Møhlenpris neighborhood. This is a before picture of Google Street View that we have. So, and we've quite a number of private cars parked on the street. And the city was planning to redesign this street and implement some underground trash collection system, and saw this as an opportunity to implement a mobility hub and to create a better quality and more inclusive public space. And this is the design that was come up by the city. They plan to include bicycle parking, so open and then covered bicycle hangars, a car sharing station, mobilpunkt, you can see it at the back, and also provide more space for pedestrians and take out some of this on-street parking. However, the people living in the neighborhoods there had different ideas, and they were much more ambitious than the city. So this is a design that was created by a neighborhood initiative to remove all on-street car parking, which in some contexts I think is quite unusual, but to provide more space for people and more the shared space for a number of purposes. And I think this is a great example of bottom-up initiative and city government coming together and to form a compromise and to make the best of the situation. And this is what it turned into. So the city responded really openly and flexibly to the needs and wishes of the neighborhood, and implemented the mobility hub across this stretch, but also included or incorporated the design elements that the neighborhood was asking for, places for children to play, public seating, more green space. You can see tables there on the top right side. So they brought all these things together, the bicycle sharing, the underground trash collection, the car share station is also still there, and it created a wonderfully inclusive space. And I think this is often something that transport planners perhaps tend to forget. I think about their mobility measure and only that. So kind of including, I would like to offer some words of encouragement for planners, especially transport planners, who are planning mobility hubs and looking to bring shared mobility into their cities, which is great, because shared mobility is a way for cities to tackle emissions issues, reducing number of privately owned cars in cities, and increasing more flexible and more diverse mobility options for the citizens. But it's not just about transport. Mobility hub can be so much. So I'd like to encourage planners to be flexible and consider broader needs of the community that they're planning for. And that means all members, young and old, active, those with limited physical abilities, or people of different cultural backgrounds. And also to not be afraid to think outside of the box and be a bit avant-garde sometimes. So, I'd like to conclude with that. Mobility hub can be so much more.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I suppose your presentation connects quite well with the previous two ones. Thank you. It was a little bit more technical, but necessary. The question of micro mobility hubs. Okay. I wonder if, for instance, in your city in Bremen, I hope that you have in the future the possibility to put thousands of those places, thousands and thousands of those places in everywhere. And particularly, it would be one of my main thoughts, or first thoughts, not in so obvious places, not only in squares, not only in main symbolical places, but sometimes in the most unexpected and even most social unused places. So it can be at the same time a good term of micro urban planning in terms of use of the different spaces. That can be quite interesting and connecting quite well the land use, the soil use with the mobility in a micro mobility, nano mobility almost. That's quite important. So thank you very much. I have already 3 questions from the audience, which are quite relevant. So I'm going to put it, one for Annabella. Well, I suppose all the questions are not for a specific speaker, but you can all the 3 reflect and we can all debate about that. The first one would be, what about isolated countryside cities? Your work in Annabella about the age population is quite important, but how can we manage that in more isolated neighborhoods from the main centralities? That would be the first one. The second one, second question put by someone from our audience, is about the equity. Nick, you have told us that, and I'm going to read the question, you've told us that the topic of equality versus equity is now more important than 5 years ago. The question is, do you really think so? Do you really think that in terms of general and global urban politics and mobility management politics? And another one is, I suppose, generally for all, how to achieve a good balance or a perfect balance to have public spaces more inclusive, nudging people to choose more sustainable ways of transport or public intervention, or even forcing people to adopt new habits. Okay, and then now we have a final one, just fresh. Are e-scooters included into those services that Rebecca has spoken? Did you understood? Okay.
No.
Okay, so I'll pass for the same order, first Annabella, then Nick, and then Rebecca.
Okay, so I believe the first question or the first issue was about in what concerns less dense areas, namely rural areas. Of course, this project of MobiH considered a focus group that is the one living in city centers. But it's not difficult to think and to imagine the difficulties of people living in rural areas. All of us know someone that lives there, or some relative, or some grandpa or something. So we know the difficulties that these areas face in terms of transport. And in the general concern in terms of avoiding the use of the car. And we have here several levels. And again, thinking about not only the elderly, but everyone, I think there are two scales or two main levels in what concerns these areas in terms of mobility. One is the pedestrian mobility, walking. And we know many of these areas where we don't have even a small sidewalk between people's houses and the village center, for example. Because streets just became dominated by car trips. So these possibilities should be reinforced and should be regained in these small villages, or in these small or big villages in less dense rural areas. So to bring back again the possibility to do all the short distances by foot, walking, giving those conditions again. Another problem is, of course, the one that relates with the public transport and the accessibility of these populations to the basic services, to access basic services like health services and other services. So I think there's a big challenge. I believe it's one of the biggest challenges at the moment in terms of mobility, is precisely how to design and how to manage transportation systems that are affordable, that are feasible, and that can support these needs for mobility, like the on-demand transportation systems and this kind of possibilities to shared systems. I know that, as Nick was saying, we are now in the period where for some time we don't feel comfortable in using shared vehicles. Anyway, I think the challenge for the future in terms of provide transportation to access activities in these areas is huge, is very big. Indeed, it has to do with business models. For example, business models for companies and for municipalities. How can this assistance can be feasible? Of course, information technologies will be a very important, are already and will be in the future very important ally. But we also must think in some limitations of some from the side of some persons in using them. But we should not forget also that within 20 years, 10 to 20 years, the people that will reach an older age are not that not used to use technologies, will be used to use technologies. So this problem will somehow be overcome in the future. So we need to adapt technology for the present moment, of course, but also thinking that in the future it's not going to be an issue. And it's optimization. The people that work with optimization models have and using those optimization models in order to have good business models for these sustainable systems is one of them. In terms of research, I believe it's one of the main lines for the future, because as you know, Portugal, the countryside in Portugal is becoming more and more lonely, and yes, and isolated. So it's a very, very important challenge in social terms. So we are talking about social. The second issue was the one that was for everyone.
Yes, it would be directly to Nick, but the question whether the equity debate it's more important than it was 5 years ago.
So I think Nick can answer that. Yes. Because you told there was one question for everyone, so that's why. But okay. This is for Nick. So Nick, go ahead.
Thank you.
It's your turn.
Yes.
Yes.
But Nick, if you can give me 5 seconds, yes, you have that question, which is quite relevant, more important now than 5 years ago in terms of equity. But I would like, if possible, for you to answer, not if it is more important for us, consultants, professors, academics, but for effective policies. For the effective politics, we are in Europe, most of us, and for instance, now we are dealing with the proposition of the new Green Deal, as you know, and now the new funds to tackle the coronavirus and the pandemic impact in terms of society and economics. Do you think that repositioning of the concept of equity in terms of mobility, I will not going to ask you in other dimensions, of course, can be really in the political agendas, and can we start to have a change in terms of the new plans for our cities? And in that sense, if you don't mind for me to add one more thing, can we have strong policies in terms of positive discrimination of the most vulnerable groups that we are discussing here today?
Yes, I was writing it down so I don't forget it. Perfect. 1, 2, 3. So the first question is like, is equity now more important than it was 5 years ago? And I'm not saying 5 years ago it was not important. I'm saying now it is really important, and that is because there's now urgency for policy changes. If I would quote Nixon, probably not the best president to quote, but he said like, nothing solves something better than a good crisis. Like, we have now an urgency to change something, and we all can see that it's not going to work. All the mobility models are going to predict it's not going to work. So we really have to use our intellect at this moment to really think like, what can we do in behavior levels, but also on policy levels? Because the chances are like there's a bigger risk to get COVID, so people will be more aware of it, so behavior is going to change. I can't read my handwriting. Yeah, and also if you were a former train user and you're not feeling comfortable because you're elderly, for example, to use the train at this point, and you have the money to buy your car and go everywhere, you're not going to sell your car after 3 months. You're probably going to keep using it. So we really have to give people the opportunity now to have a good alternative. And I believe that policy is one of the best things to do it. And the policies that I would suggest is have a massive investment in cycle lanes. And it's also quite financially appealing, because 1 meter of cycle tracks is 1/10 of the price of 1 meter of car lanes. So it is a wise decision. If you need to densify your city center in 1 meter of 1 meter of cycle tracks, you can fit more people on bikes than you can with riding their cars. That is the opportunity to densify it, because public transport is for a lot of people not going to be the main get to go to for the upcoming years. If you let all those people now go towards their car and let them buy a car and give them, that is the only opportunity you have, they will keep using it. And then all the good work that we've been working on for the last years will be minimalized. So in terms of effective policies, so have the investment in active mobility, and then not think about only how do we get people on bikes, but also investigate why they're not on bikes yet. So what do they need? And then you come to positive discrimination, as you asked, like what do an elderly woman need to move around actively? So I showed a picture of, instead of a bicycle, a tricycle with hand movements, like that could be an option. And if you have that in a safe environment, because I truly believe that if you want to make inclusive cities and want to make active mobility a better option than it is now, people need to have an increased perception of safety. And therefore, that is really where we should go to, like, upscale the capacity and make sure it's safe.
Thank you. Okay. Very well. Thank you very much. I have two questions. Yeah, it's fine. It's quite interesting. I have two questions to Rebecca. One, considering the electronic scooters, if they are included in your micromobility hubs, and the other one, the classical one, what to do about the parking needs when we want to make public space requalification?
I think the first question is really easy to answer. In Bremen, electric scooters shared scooters are not included at the Mobilpunkte, but we found them gathering there naturally. When users stop using their scooter, they look at where is a good place to park it, and they tend to park them if there's a mobility hub. And in Bremen, there are 44 at the moment of the 110 car share stations. 44 of them are Mobilpunkte. They sort of tend to gravitate there. It's sort of a natural order that results from it. But from the mobility hub concept in a broader sense, of course, electric scooters can be included there. Whether electric scooters contribute to social inclusion is questionable. I would say the average user of a e-scooter is between the ages of 18 and 25 years old and is male. So that's at least the largest user group, and I would not call that one a socially inclusive user group across all scales. But it's part of the whole mix, and the variety is what makes new mobility forms more attractive than the privately owned cars. That flexibility and the ability to choose the type of vehicle that meets one's individual mobility needs at that moment. And so it's, let's say, part of an overall system that can be beneficial for managing public space in cities and other transport challenges like gaps in the public transport network. That question about parking spaces, you say? Parking needs?
For the cars.
Well, the whole idea of a mobility hub is to provide an alternative to privately owned cars, and therefore justifying the public expenditure to create mobility hubs. We know that specifically round-trip car sharing has a very positive impact on reducing car ownership. In Bremen, one shared car replaces 16 privately owned cars. That's a very high replacement quota, also because we have a high cycling modal share, a high modal share of walking, so that a lot of things come together there. And a very dense network of car sharing stations that makes the service attractive and easy to access. So therefore, by implementing mobility hubs that feature car sharing predominantly, we are reducing the parking pressure and even the need for parking in the public realm. Obviously in Bremen, we still have a long way to go. The second picture I showed you is an example of many streets here in the city, but it's one of the soft measures that the city is applying to tackle that parking pressure in the public realm. So the more options you have, the more attractive, easy, flexible, convenient alternatives you have to individual car ownership, the less parking you will need. And that applies to the public realm as well as parking garages in existing infrastructure as well as new housing development. And maybe in the discussion that we have all together, there's that question about how to achieve a good balance, between and the social equity in the public realm. And there's two scenarios, the existing built to urban space as well as opportunities that new housing developments provide. For some of the examples that Nick said, including more cycling infrastructure, but also these inclusive mobility services as something that you find directly outside your door, rather than finding a private car directly outside your door.
Very well. Very well. Thank you very much, Rebecca. That's very good. So we all agree, I suppose, that we are clearly entering the transition phase. We should enter 1 decade ago at least. But we also agree on the positive discrimination of the most vulnerable. And when we're talking about the most vulnerable, is not only about the classical social groups. It's most vulnerable in terms of the demographic aspects, as you said, the elder, the children, but also in terms of socioeconomic circumstances. We have metropolitan areas with very poor people all around Europe, and not only in the classical north and south divide, of course not. We have to understand it in the inner circumstances of our cities, even if they are small, not only the large ones, but we have to make that positive discrimination. That would be possibly the best circumstances. I remember almost 20 years ago, an educational expert told me we should put the best teachers in the most problematic schools. Maybe we should have the most interesting and innovative mobility solutions in the most unexpected places. That would be also interesting in terms of social inclusion, in my view. And that's for you to think about, just a reflection here on the debate. I would like to hear all of you three in one final comment, considering the coronavirus crisis. Do you think it is going to deeply change not our mobility patterns? We still don't know, but at least the views that you have on your focuses of your attentions of your research projects in the first or in the same order. Annabella, Nick,
in the same. Yes, as I said earlier, I think the lines of research and of concern we are working on, I think they are kept the same, but they are reinforced with through this new situation, with new factors, with new things that we need to integrate. And I think that overall, besides of all the things I already spoke about, we need to, there's no longer sustainable the way globally we move using a car for the car with only one occupant, a car with a combustion engine vehicle, with only one occupant for short distance trips. There's no longer sustainable. Fact, that's a fact. So everything we should do in the future, because it has a lot of consequences, etc., emissions. So there's no need to talk about that. We all know that it's rather complex. But I think that all actions we should do in the future is to minimize this type of trips. And that includes, as Rebecca was telling us and giving those examples in Bremen, to limitate parking, to tax park, etc. So there are a lot of actions that municipalities, starting with the policy, of course, global, national and local policies that can use to tax the use of this of the car for this kind of trips, in order to limitate them, and then to use this money to feed other type of systems that provide this more sustainable way of moving and thinking. So there's a lot of things we can do. Of course, the problem of the need to keep social, physical, it's not, in this sense, it's not social distance, it's physical distance we need to keep for now. And as Nick was saying, even if we get coronavirus, we only have 1 or 2 years of immunity, and then we might get it again, or a new virus. So we have to expect this kind of things in the future. So that means that cities globally need to rethink how we use public space, because it's about inside our homes, it's something, but about public space that we all share. We need to rethink this space. We need to create extra space, extra conditions, both from the side of public transport and of transport systems, how we can share those systems, but with safety, on one side, and on the other side, in terms of urban design of cities of the future, we also need to rethink this urban design, because we need to have conditions to move and to move safely, giving this highlight and this promotion of the active modes of transportation, which are there's another thing I would like to say about the active modes that Nick also stressed, is that they are highly democratic.
We're running out of time.
Yes, they are highly democratic. So if you improve them if you improve the conditions for people to move in short distance by walking or using the bicycle, you are, as a politician or as a technician, you are promoting highly democratic conditions for people to access jobs and for people to move. Of course, you can translate that into public transport also, but that's it. I think that our concerns for the future should be focused on this kind of issues, for sure.
I fully agree. Yes, Nick, thank you very much, Annabella. Nick?
Yes, so how the COVID-19 virus will change our mobility focus in research. I think there indeed will be a change. If you look at population growth, it will continue to rise for the upcoming 80 years. And the chances of another pandemic are closely connected with that population growth. So the chance that we will see another one in the upcoming 80 years is not unlikely. So this is really something we should think about. And the focus on our research projects, something that we completely neglected in the last 10 years. How can we have safe, and by safe, I mean now clean mobility. So especially shared mobility, how can you do it in a way that you don't infect other people by doing so? And that is something in our work field we have probably no clue about. And that is something we should really think about, like what are the health implications for our mobility patterns at this moment, especially for Europe with an aging population.
Okay, thank you very much. And Rebecca?
Just to counter a little quickly, Nick, shared mobility forms aren't more infectious than the supermarket shopping cart or the door handle that somebody has touched before. I mean, we shouldn't forget that COVID-19 is most infectious for droplet person-to-person infection. So I know the shared mobility companies are doing quite a bit right now to deal with the fear of infection in vehicles and developing quite proactive hygiene concepts. So not to scare anybody, but I mean it's a valid fear of users. You're right. What hasn't changed with COVID-19 is the need to reduce transport-related emissions. Climate change is still an issue, regardless of COVID-19. Okay. Social inclusion, inclusive spaces is also still an issue, and it always will be. So the need to revise parking strategies and to reclaim public street space from privately owned vehicles, all those things haven't changed. What has changed, or at least become more relevant, is that cities need to have an even better understanding of the shared mobility market. Because as they start to integrate shared mobility into their policies, they need to understand that shared mobility providers are small and medium-sized enterprises, mostly, especially those servicing smaller towns, more rural communities. So by having a better understanding of, what is required for a business case and what cities and what policies they can have to be supportive of the shared mobility providers, means that they can increase the resilience of these providers with this pandemic and the next one that is almost inevitable, basically, or another disruptive crisis. So policies that support shared mobility providers and these small and medium enterprises so that they can continue to support sustainable transport goals. I would say that's the most important revelation of this time.
Very well. Okay. Thank you very much, Rebecca, also for you. It's 1600 sharp. So our 90 minutes have passed. Meanwhile, I've received more questions, but as I received from the coordination, the order for the 90 minutes, I would propose for those questions to pass to our speakers and maybe answered by other means, by email or by other possibilities. I would like to thank you all, and once again to the Câmara Municipal de Cascais, Paulo Marques, Beatriz Gonçalves, Robert Sussi, and of course to all of you three for the excellent talk that we had today. And I'd like to say to everyone that is listening to us, it looks like the radio is, that next week, next Tuesday, we'll have the final conference here with all the different moderators and have a broader debate about the main conclusions of mobility management of all this entire conference. Thank you very much to everyone. Have a nice afternoon.
Bye. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Bye.